Hello everybody, this is Stephen Pugh of the Home Bible College. I want to do my third video in the series on the King James Bible, and we're following this particular book here. It's called In the Beginning by Alistair McGrath, and we've got other books that we're going to follow as well. For example, we're going to be looking at this, which is the King James Bible, the original Bible of 1611. It's a he version. And so we're going to be following that too, and we're also going to be following another book, which is the history of the King James Bible. So this is going to be very interesting, and it's going to be probably quite a big series. So we're only on video number 3, but we're in chapter 1 of the story of the King James Bible, and the big point about chapter 1 is the new technology. Now today in our modern world we have a lot of new technology. I mean, the radio was a massive invention. Information technology and computers was a massive invention completely. Now before that we had the railway, and before that we had various technologies in the area of metalworking. And of course, after the railway came the massive innovation of oil production and oil-driven machines, including the motor car. So these are all the great inventions of a previous century. However, back in the 15th century, there were other inventions. And sometimes these inventions were quite insignificant. They didn't appear to be greatly significant, but at other times they were world changing. Let's just talk about some of them. So in 1620 we have 3 main inventions in the 15th century. We have printing, we have the production of gunpowder in large quantities, and we also have the magnet. And there was an invention that came a couple of hundred years after that, which went alongside the magnet, which was the invention of an accurate chronometer. Now let me tell you about what these 3 things did. Printing totally revolutionized the whole world. People began to read. Even little boys were taught to read. And sometimes they could learn to read quite quickly. Most children at a particular age can read quite quickly. Sometimes the schools would wait until the child was about 5 or even older before they began, and you can imagine at the age of 5 they were ready. They had the intelligence, they just needed to have the teaching. So printing completely transformed the whole of Europe, absolutely transformed it. It just completely turned it upside down. The other thing that was a massive invention was the invention of gunpowder, which had been around for quite a long time, but bringing it into Europe and using it in warfare was completely revolutionary. And then the other 2 things, the magnet, first of all, being able to magnetize a needle to enable you to find magnetic north when you're on the seas. This opened up the oceans, and in particular in Britain it opened up an empire. And later, of course, there was another invention, which was the chronometer. So what the magnet did was to enable the mariners to find true north, not true north, but magnetic north. What the chronometer did was enable them to find longitude, so they could find out how far across the oceans they're traveling by using a very, very accurate clock. Okay, so these are the great things that were the revolutionary inventions of the 15th century. But in the 15th century, the feudal system collapsed. Now, the feudal system was a very, very old system in which effectively the king owned every piece of land in the whole country, and he took rents, and everybody was effectively a slave to the king. Okay, but there were a number of things that happened in that particular period in which the feudal system collapsed in upon itself. The first thing that happened was plagues. There were a number of plagues, and that number of plagues reduced the population from huge numbers into small numbers. And suddenly we have the emergence of what we call the merchant class. People began to have private farms, and they began to have wealth in their pocket. And they also began to have shops where things could be sold, where bread could be sold, rather than making it yourself at home. So this absolutely transformed the whole of life in the 15th century. Now, the other thing that happened in the 15th century was that there was a revival of religion. A revival of religion. People aren't aware of that. And the effect of the revival of religion was a desire to improve oneself in terms of education. So there was a huge transformation and a desire to read. Reading became the thing. There was a massive demand for books. Of course, a lot of the books were printed using what they call a block. So it's a piece of wood where you carved out every little piece, and that meant that you were able to create what were early pictures, and you were able to also do early lettering. But this was quite laborious, in fact very laborious, and the books that were printed the books that were produced could not meet the demand of the masses. The masses wanted to read, and they didn't just want to read good books, they wanted to read bad books as well. So there was a huge demand, and people can read, and the manufacturers of books couldn't keep up with it all. Along came a man called Johannes Gutenberg. Now, Johannes Gutenberg is the person that is reckoned to have invented printing. Now, there were printing in certain types, and there was printing, but what Johannes Gutenberg is, he brought together a number of things that would enable it all to take place. He brought together 6 things. 6 things had to come together to enable printing to become effectively modern. So the first thing he brought together was the movable type. Now, Johannes Gutenberg had been a metal worker. He'd been a metal worker, first of all in Maine and then in Strasbourg. And in the metalworking, he had developed certain skills and he developed certain knowledge to be able to produce a mirror. It was a metal mirror, highly polished, exceptionally good quality. And that was his trade. And he learnt all the skills of metalworking. And some of the things that he did were quite innovative. They were the first time that they were ever done. And what Johannes Gutenberg realized was that there needed to be a number of inventions brought together, 6 of them in particular, brought together in such a way that you could then have a printed book. Now, how did he do it? Well, the first invention was movable type. And being a metal worker, he pretty well, now he didn't completely invent the movable type, but he did develop the concept of movable type. And so every single letter had its own individual item, and he was able to then to use hundreds, thousands of these individual items to create words and to create what's called a block. And that block was a large a large block of wood where all the type was crammed in, and it was turned into what they called a pie, and that was all the letters that would go onto a page. Now, bear in mind that all the letters had to be back to front. So you see, Gutenberg had been working with mirrors. He had no difficulty in conceiving of all of these ideas. The other thing that he did was he had, through his work as a metal worker, he had developed a type of metal that was exceptionally durable. exceptionally durable. It would last a long time. It was made of lead and tin and antimony. Now these three metals put together and mixed together created exactly the right material needed to make movable type, and he tried to keep this secret for as long as he could because it was the basis of all printing in the future. The other thing that had been invented a little time before was called the wooden screw press. So this was a large wooden screw with a big nut, as it were, with handles on, and you could bring it down. This was borrowed from the olive industry and from other industries that used presses, and so that was something which was incorporated into the printing press. That's why it was called a press. Most of the time, as they were bringing it down, the platen, as it's called, as it came down, it would then turn slightly. At the very end, it would turn slightly, and that would smudge the letters. And so another thing had to be invented, which was called the box. Now the box was was, if you can imagine, a wooden box, but with a lip going all around it. And that meant that as the press came down, and as you did the last turn, it didn't turn. It would not turn to smudge. It would stay within that box and it could not smudge. And that meant, of course, that they were then able to produce copies of a sheet of paper in perfect, crisp lettering. The other things, that's three things. The other thing that had to happen was there needed to be a new type of ink. Okay, and eventually what was created was what's called the black oil-based ink. This came from the lamp black, which was the soot that was inside a lamp, and that was taken and certain oils were used, and it produced an ink that was absolutely ideally suited for printing. Now the next thing that needed to be incorporated was a new type of medium to print onto. People used vellum in those days. Vellum was basically skins of animals. It was exceptionally durable. Everybody preferred it, but the ink itself did not sink into the vellum. It sat on the surface, and if you licked your finger and touched it, you could remove the ink. Okay, so this wasn't permanent. What Johannes Gutenberg discovered was that paper was by far the better medium. As the ink was applied to the paper, it sank into the paper and it dried quite quickly, and that meant that it could not be rubbed off. This became a permanent ink. Okay, and the next thing that needed is, it's one thing to have all of these things, but you see, you have to have the financial investment to enable you to do it. So Gutenberg eventually was able to gather investment of 800 guldens. Okay, now that in today's money would be equivalent to over £1 million. That's a huge amount of investment. Massive. Probably one of the biggest investments in the world at that time. So now in 1452, the great challenge for Gutenberg was not just to produce bits of paper and little pamphlets. He, for example, at one particular stage was in the business of producing indulgences. Now these indulgences were little slips of paper, and on it would be a promise from the Pope, from the Roman Catholic Church, that you could have some time off from purgatory by the payment of some money. Now Gutenberg produced an awful lot of these indulgences. It was one of his most profitable sidelines. Okay, if you can call it a sideline, because he produced, in his lifetime, he produced over 200,000 of them. That's a lot. And he made a lot of money. That's the purpose of he was a businessman. That's the point. He was a businessman. He was into making money, and he did make a fortune. Now, in 1450, the great challenge was to produce a Bible. The great challenge was to produce a Bible. And there was a number of things about this. First of all, he wanted to do it because it was a challenge. It was a challenge, a big challenge. I mean, in his particular version, in his particular Bible, and we have a copy of it here, okay, you can count the columns. You'll see that this is what's called a 36-line Bible. A 36-line Bible. So there's 36 lines on the page. And this particular Bible needed to have 1,768 pages. That's a massive thing. In fact, in the beginning, it was printed in 2 volumes because 1,768 is a huge, huge size. The Bibles in those days were measured by the inch. They were really thick. Now, the other thing is that the Bible was incredibly popular. Incredibly popular. Everybody wanted to have a copy of the Bible. It was in those days the world's bestseller. There was no other book printed in such quantities. And of course, that remains true even today. There are more Bibles printed than any other book in the world. Now, each page would have on it 2 columns of text. I can show you this on this Bible here. Can you see the 2 columns of text? One column here and another one next to it. There was a custom with scribes to never have a line that was longer than about 3 inches, which is about the length of your middle finger, about 3 inches long. The reason for that is if it's a very, very, very long line, you get to the end of it, and as you bring your eye back across, you can't figure out which line you're supposed to be reading. So they always had about a 3-inch line. That was a very, very common practice. So each page had 2 columns. They also had references in the side, and they also had marginal notes at the bottom. And you can see it on this particular copy. You'll see that it's got references down the side. Can you see the references here? And can you see notes at the bottom as well? So these Bibles in the very beginning were effectively study Bibles already. We're familiar with study Bibles, aren't we? Study Bibles are those Bibles that have references and notes on the page. But these early Bibles, they were study Bibles, no question about that. Now, Gutenberg produced 185 copies, 185 Bibles, and 40 of them still exist today. There may be more that exist, but have just not been found. It consisted of 340 sheets, and they cost 3 months' wages for a clerk. Okay, a clerk was a sort of a middle-class worker in a business, and he would have to save for 3 whole years to be able to afford to have one Bible. Now, they were printed in batches. They used a lot of different printers, and they used a lot of different compilers. Eventually, there were 16 compilers that put the Bibles together, this was a massive undertaking, and there were mistakes that came into the text, just minor mistakes, but mistakes nevertheless. They tended to print all of the variations of text that were available. Instead of making a selection as to those aspects of text that were considered to be genuine, they would just put everything in. It was a habit to just put everything in. Now, the next great person that we need to know about is a person called William Caxton. He was the first printer in England. He started in the continent. He started learning all about printing. He lived between 1422 and 91, and he came to Britain, and he set up a printing shop in Westminster. Westminster is the old city of London. I don't know whether you know, but there are two Londons. There's London, and then there's the City of London. The City of London is a small area in the centre of London, which is effectively its own separate country with its own separate laws and its own separate judicial system. So that's the city of Westminster. That's where he began. Gutenberg, in spite of creating this printing invention and bringing all of these things together, he died in abject poverty as a very old man, which is very sad. Now, the next person that we need to know about is a person called John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe. Now, Wycliffe produced a version of the Bible. It was a translation from the Latin into English. Okay, the Latin was available. The Vulgate was available in Latin, and he translated that into English so that every single person that was able to read would be able to read the Bible. It was scholarly, seriously scholarly. 90% or so of the authorized version is just taken straight from the John Wycliffe Bible. Okay, but those changes from the Wycliffe Bible were not necessarily favorable. They were not necessarily a good change. Now, John Wycliffe lived between 1330 and 1384, so he's living way before Caxton. He produced the first English Bible in the English language, and his objective was that every single person would be able to read the Bible in English for themselves without any difficulty. That was his great objection. However, he was way before his time. He was 100 years plus in advance of his time. And this caused a massive revolution in the country, huge revolution. In 1381, there was what we call the Peasants' Revolt. Now, the Peasants' Revolt was because the government brought in a new tax. It was a poll tax. It was 1 shilling for every man over the age of 16. And this nearly caused the whole of the country to fall to pieces, nearly. There was a huge rebellion about the matter. Now, what Wycliffe did was to enable the people of his day to be able to understand what God has to say in the Bible. And so there was this great challenge to the English church system. Is it the English church that is the final authority on everything in life, or is it the scriptures that are the final authority in everything in life in England? And that was the great thing. So what England did, and they sort of the church and the crown, they were frightened. They were frightened of the rebellion that could occur. They were frightened of the fact that they could all be completely deposed from their position. So what they did is they shut England down. That's amazing, isn't it? But they shut England down. They made not just possessing a Bible, but having a Bible in your house was equivalent to heresy. You could be just executed for having one. That's you see, the church panicked and the crown panicked, and they made it a heretical thing to even possess or to read a Bible. So England shut down. However, the continent of Europe didn't. And there were lots of countries in Europe that you could go to. And that's what Wycliffe did. He went to the continent. And he was able to set up his printing, and he was able to, he was able to set up his Bible production there. And he was able to smuggle the Bibles into England. That's what they did. They smuggled them in huge quantities. You could get a barrel, okay, full of straw, and you could get an awful lot of Bibles in it. And of course, it was virtually impossible to be detected. You could not open every barrel that came from Europe into England. You just couldn't do that. You know, there might be grapes, there might be oil, there might be wheat, whatever's in the barrel, you just cannot open every barrel. And of course, England was flooded with the Wycliffe Bible. And the Wycliffe Bible was superb. By the way, I have a copy of the Wycliffe Bible. It's not bound in the way in which it was originally bound, but it is a copy, and you're able to read it. And there's some very, very, very interesting things that come out from reading the Wycliffe Bible. So this is just chapter 1. You can see that England and Europe were going through massive revolutions. They were going through revolutions of thought. They were going through revolutions of invention. Okay? And there were 6 inventions that came together to enable there to be the printing of an English Bible by Johannes Gutenberg. Well, there we are. That's our video for today. We look forward to catching up with you on our next installment. So have a great day, and God bless you all. Bye for now.